It seems unbelievable, but there are thousands of 3D photographs taken of the First World War, yet none of them have ever been shown on TV in their original format. Now we've recreated the original stereoscopic effect to bring some of these incredible images back to life. In the last episode of this series, we saw how Britain had to create a huge new army of volunteers, and we followed their progress to the trenches and then to the Battle of the Somme in summer 1916. The war was now all-consuming, demanding huge sacrifices from every nation involved in the fighting. In this film, we'll see how both sides transformed themselves into ever more powerful killing machines, creating unprecedented technological innovations in an attempt to break the stalemate of the Western Front. I'll find out how the new ways of killing demanded rapid advances in medicine, and how industrial warfare called upon every citizen to play their part. But as more and more was demanded of us to feed the war machine, were we beginning to lose our humanity? I'm inside one of the most iconic buildings in the whole world. And this mechanism is its beating heart. So why am I here? Well, in 1916, the war put a stop to this clock, which kept time for an empire. The war in Europe had now arrived on Britain's doorstep thanks to these Zeppelins. This is a photograph of one above a town, and look at it, just floating there. It's menacing, isn't it? This house in Southend was blown apart by a bomb dropped from one of these. What depresses me is that the miracle of manned flight was still a new phenomenon, and yet already it was being used to kill people. The Zeppelin campaign against Britain started in 1915. The early ships could carry up to 2 tons of bombs. While they weren't capable of precision bombing military targets, they could inflict indiscriminate and horrific damage on the civilians below them. D.H. Lawrence witnessed an air raid in London and wrote, "We saw the Zeppelin above us, high up like a bright gold finger. Then there were flashes near the ground and a shaking noise. There was war in heaven. I can't get over it." In 1916, the year of the Somme, the Zeppelins raided Britain 23 times. They dropped 125 tons of bombs and killed 293 civilians. It was widely believed that the airships were using the light from Big Ben and the sound of the bells to target the capital. So for the first time in its history, the great bell was silenced, the clock was stopped, and the lights were switched off. Quite simply, this was the first Blitz. I asked historian and author Gerard de Groot how the British handled these early air raids. How did we deal with the attacks on the home front, like the Zeppelins? What was their effect?
In terms of material damage, the effect was really quite small. What was really the effect of it was the shock that suddenly war was being, taken to ordinary people on the streets of the big cities. This is something which we now associate with war, isn't it? If a war breaks out, the first thing you do is bomb and hope that that'll sort things out. Back then, this idea of a plane or a Zeppelin coming over and dropping bombs on innocent women and children, that's really something that takes an enormous sort of moral leap to be able to accept that.
This little plaque up on the wall commemorates the first bomb dropped by a Zeppelin on London, which landed here in the back garden of this pub. Actually, my whole family come from round here. My grandpa and grandma had a little flat over a tobacconist a few streets away in Clapton. And they would have been as terrified as everyone else when those first silver ships appeared in the sky and the bombs started falling. This is one of those bombs, which didn't go off, thankfully. It landed on a street in Southend, and it's captured in all its deadly glory by a 3D photograph. It's one of thousands of 3D images we've looked at to bring this war back to life. They were taken with a little camera like this, which has got two lenses about 3 inches apart, which replicate the way the eyes work. They take two almost identical photos, which are then put into a viewer, like that. You looked at them through the viewer, and the brain fuses those two images into one 3D image. And that technology is as old as photography itself. This is the wreckage of a Zeppelin that caught fire and crashed over France. And it could have fallen a long way. Their maximum altitude was a staggering 14,000 feet. A lot of 3D images were sold as cards to the public, and a popular image was that of the downed Zeppelin in all its tangled metal glory. This one looks like some great gutted dinosaur, its bleached skeleton stretched out for all to see. Zeppelins were kind of bogeymen for the British public, but they were never going to win the war. When it came to cutting-edge technology, Britain had created something which would prove to be much more of a game changer. Tanks, as they became known, were first tried out in limited numbers in September 1916 during the Battle of the Somme. These early prototypes didn't make much of an impression on the battle, but they did in the minds of the British top brass. This was a wonder weapon, which would give hope and pride to the British people in the absence of success on the field. It was a mighty land ship which would cross the hellfire of no man's land and crush the enemy. It was the key which would unlock the deadlock. Or at least it would be if it worked and we knew how to use it. To try and understand what it was like to go to war in one of these monsters, I've met up with tank owner and enthusiast Kevin Jepson. I know that eventually the tanks were really successful, but they had some teething problems, didn't they?
They did, massively. They were put into action very, very quickly. The development time was very short because of the tactical necessity to get them in. So they were slow because of the weight and the underpowered engines.
They kept tipping over, didn't they?
If the drivers got it very badly wrong, if they hit a trench, instead of crossing the trench like though, if they went laterally, it would fall in.
I know this one looks safe as houses, but actually inside they can be very dangerous.
It was hot, the engine would get up to 120 degrees, there was carbon monoxide leaking from the engine, it was deafening. So crews would come out really badly physically affected by this.
And that's before they even start shooting through.
You try and knock holes in this, as the Germans would do.
Yeah.
Their first reaction was to use rifle bullets. They'd turn the rifle bullet round, take it out of the cartridge, fit it back in, hit them with the flat. It would scab off metal inside, known as spalling or splatter. And that would fly around the tank at very high speed, bits of paint flowing around. Very, very unpleasant place to be. If they penetrated it, the tank was a goner. The fuel tanks on the very early ones were at the front. 70 gallons of petrol, directly by the driver commander, bang.
One tank commander described the grueling experience of being inside one as a living hell due to heat, fumes and bullet splash. I suppose the great thing is that although there was so much bad news from the Somme, the tank did provide some sense of victory.
It did, and the press were desperate to get their hands on information about this. The first photographs published in the Daily Mirror showed the tank in action, and the headline was, "Tanks go galumphant." And it was this massive feeling of, we've got a wonder weapon, we can turn the war. It was desperately needed.
Tanks gave a much-needed boost to morale. These superweapons would feature in their own documentary, The Battle of the Ancre. War films were another new innovation that coincided with the conflict. And one in particular had a profound effect on the British public. This is the Imperial War Museum in London. From the outside, it looks as though it's all about guns and glory, but it's actually a treasure house of people's history, the story of human lives. It was founded before the First World War was finished, before anyone even knew whether we'd survive. But the war had been such a unique and transforming experience, not just for the soldiers, but for everyone involved, that there was an overwhelming desire to record and document what was happening before we even knew the outcome. The museum was built so anyone who lived through the war should be able to recognise their contribution in the collection. As for the soldiers, they'd unwittingly provide the museum with its most powerful exhibit: their words. Over 12.5 million letters left Britain each week for the Western Front, and it took just 2 days to send a reply back from the trenches. I asked Laura Clouting of the Imperial War Museum how this war was connected to people on the home front.
Not only do you have swathes of letters and parcels being sent between people, keeping alive a contact, but you've also got new ways of finding out about the war. You've got photography coming into its own. You've got film. And one of the major films of the war, the most significant film, is one called The Battle of the Somme.
The Somme film first hit cinemas in August 1916, just 6 weeks after the actual fighting, and remains one of the most widely viewed documentaries ever made.
For the first time, this film allows people to see what their loved ones have been doing, showing men on the march, artillery being fired, men being wounded. It shows all aspects of life on the front. But what it really does is create a sense of a compelling immediacy to this war that previously might have felt a little bit distant from people.
A critic in The Times wrote, "It was wise that the people at home should have this glimpse of what our soldiers are doing and daring and suffering." 20 million people saw that film, which arrived on the big screen at the same time that some people in the audience were receiving letters saying that their sons or husbands had died in the battle. The war was taking an incredible psychological toll on the British people and affecting their everyday lives. Soon it would affect what we ate, or rather, it would affect the ships that brought us our food. Because the stalemate in the trenches led Germany to take the fight to the seas. Before the war, they'd invested heavily in submarines or U-boats. Now, those machines were targeting merchant ships in an effort to starve the British into submission. Here's one which was captured and then put on display on the Thames. It was a kind of tourist attraction, and this really would pull a crowd, because boats like this were wreaking havoc. Before the war, Britain really did rule the waves. We had the most powerful navy in the world, the backbone of the British Empire. But below the waves was a very different matter. There, U-boats were king, and they could cause all sorts of problems. These were dangerous weapons, and they weren't little tiddlers either. Look at the size of this one, which was beached on the British coast. At the front of it, you can see 2 of the torpedo tubes that did so much damage. And if you look on the upper deck, you can see its formidable forward gun. It's a massive craft, isn't it? Just look at the people in relation to it. Now look at this picture of a few U-boats docked together. This was taken at the end of the war, ahead of them being scuttled and put out of action. But as historian Gordon Corrigan told me, before their threat was muted, they pushed Britain to the brink. While we were at loggerheads on the land, the German U-boats were being incredibly successful at sea, weren't they?
Yes, I mean, the whole history of the U-boat is interesting because to begin with, at the beginning of the war, they were really only able to operate along the coast. They weren't really able to get out to sea, but that quickly changes. And I suppose the one way the Germans might have been able to knock the British out of the war was indeed by submarine warfare, because we still in the First World War were importing something like 25% of all the food we ate. Britain makes its living, or that did then, by importing raw materials and exporting manufactured goods. So if you can starve them out and stop their trade, you knock them out of the war. That was the German thinking.
This is actually the inside of a torpedo room. The damage these things could do is described by U-boat commander Adolf von Spiegel, who wrote, "A slight tremor went through the boat. The torpedo had gone. The death-bringing shot was a true one, and the torpedo ran towards the doomed ship at high speed. But one sinking changed the course of the U-boat war. In May 1915, the British passenger liner the Lusitania was torpedoed with a loss of 128 US citizens. It almost brought America into the war, and it forced Germany to scale back its operations under the waves, for the time being at least. This gave Britain a brief respite, as well as an excellent piece of propaganda and another trigger to fire recruitment. While new weapons technology like U-boats, aircraft and tanks were finding their way onto the battlefield, this was still a war that was stuck in the 19th century and powered by horses. Over the course of the war, the British Army used more than 1 million of them. They also used over 20,000 dogs on the Western Front, and they had special kennels behind the trenches like these. Some breeds were so in demand they were forcibly conscripted. Imagine that, giving up a family dog for the war effort. To find out about the canine contribution, I spoke to Terry Charman, a senior historian at the Imperial War Museum. So they were essentially messengers?
Essentially messenger dogs, yes. And a dog could go about 3 to 5 times faster than a human being.
And keep lower on the ground?
Was lower on the ground, yes. And their survival rate was much greater, of course, than human messengers as well. It's reckoned that at the Battle of Verdun, the French sent out 17 human messengers to get through with a vital message. All of them were shot by Germans. None survived, but a dog managed it within minutes.
So is that one of the military dog collars?
That's one of the dog collars, and you'll see there that that's where the message would be placed in there.
Do we have any idea which dog that belonged to?
We do. It belonged to Tip, number 109 in the register, an Irish Terrier, and his handler was Private J. Nicholson of the 10th Yorkshires.
Did people treat those dogs with respect, or were they just thought of as expendable?
No, I mean, looking at the photographs in the museum's collection, sort of a strong bond of affection grew up between the dogs and their handlers. What they did have to go through, though, was a very intensive training under battle conditions.
What happened to Tip?
Well, we don't know precisely what happened to him, but at the end, at the back of the register there, they do give the fates of some of the dogs, and Tip is okay. He survives the war.
Yay! This 3D picture is fantastic. French medics trained this little dog to look for casualties on the battlefield. And when he found a wounded soldier, he'd bring the man's helmet back to the stretcher bearers and then lead them to their injured comrade, hopefully to get treated and then put back on the line, because that was the point, wasn't it? We needed horses to pull wagons, dogs to deliver messages, but above all, we needed men to fight. And there were never enough. When World War I first started, our army was made up of regular troops and reservists, like these soldiers of the British Expeditionary Force, and following Kitchener's call, many more young men enlisted. But after heavy casualties, the army needed more.
Lots of people volunteered in Britain in 1914, but nowhere near enough. When you're looking at German and French armies of 4 or 5 million, and the British army, still numbered in the hundreds of thousands, that these volunteers, all those people who are photographed queuing up outside recruiting offices, there weren't enough of them.
So in January 1916, conscription had been introduced to combat this shortfall. At first just for single men, but then for married men too. It was at this point that my grandfather John Robinson was enlisted. But as he adamantly refused to talk about his war years, and as he had just about the most popular name in the English language, I've been unable to find out what regiment he was in, where he went, or anything about what he did. What we do know is that conscription was deeply unpopular. As the war went on, more and more sons, brothers and husbands went off to fight. Britain was suddenly left with a skills shortage, and so industry looked to women. The demands of war were turning British society on its head. Despite huge offences like the Somme, the stalemate on the Western Front continued. The war of attrition was sucking in more and more soldiers for the fight, and this created a vacuum on the home front as the factories and fields, foundries and offices were emptied of men. In their absence, the women of Britain stepped up to the plate and plugged the hole in the labour market. What kind of jobs did women do in this new wartime world?
They did almost everything, really. You know, we tend to sort of think of them as the munitionettes. You know, they went in and they made shells.
Oh, these were the canaries, the women whose hands were dyed yellow by the explosives.
And working in factories, and then we tend to think that this is something they did for the first time. But actually, what was really important, I think, were the fact that women were going into a lot of sort of white-collar jobs. They were working in banks. They were becoming secretaries for the first time. I mean, we associate the job of a secretary for a long time as being a women's job, you know. But that's really something that happens in the First World War. Before the First World War, it was men that were secretaries. They become, you know, ticket collectors on buses. They drive ambulances. They do all these kinds of things that free up men to go off and fight at the front.
When this stereo photograph of a munitions factory was taken, the interesting thing for those who saw it would have been that it was a royal visit by King George V. But looking at it now, it's not the royalty that interests us, but the women in the background, because they are pioneers. But did they realise that at the time?
They sort of see themselves as temporary men. And when the men come home, they'll go back and do what they've always done. And what does change is this sense deep within them that they have this ability, that they have made a contribution.
One field where women were directly linked to the war was medicine, where they served with distinction as nurses and ambulance drivers. Overall, the war had a huge impact on medical science. I went to the Royal College of Surgeons to meet medical historian Emily Mayhew to get some hands-on experience of World War I ER. I suppose one of the ironies about war is that the better we get at injuring people, the more opportunities there are of learning how to cure them.
It's extraordinary. When I think of the First World War, I think of the soldiers going over the top, and behind them come the surgeons. In fact, behind them come stretcher bearers and orderlies and nurses, but they're keeping pace with the fighting, keeping pace with the weaponry, with the strategy and the tactics, and the challenges that war throws at them to treat people where you pick them up, where you find them, to get them to an operating theatre, to a field hospital, within 5 or 6 miles of the battle line. That's absolutely fundamental, and keeping them alive during that journey. In fact, we've got something here that's come up from the Army Medical Services Museum, and it's a Thomas splint. This really symbolises one of the most significant problems for surgeons, and that is limb loss. And limb loss can kill you. And it almost certainly will kill you until this kind of instrument came in. The leg of the patient was slid in here, and during the journey to the operating theatre, this enabled the leg to be kept absolutely stable so that there isn't any problems caused with bleeding, and the limb can probably be saved. And if the limb can be saved, the chances are the life can be saved too.
Is that an X-ray?
This is an X-ray. This is such an important part of medical practice in the Great War, because for the first time they've got X-rays, and what we see here, this is an actual shrapnel ball. You can see how dangerous that is from the location. So with a portable radiography unit right next door to surgery, in the tent next door in the field hospital, the radiographer can come running through, waving this, and tell the surgeon where he's supposed to be looking. And again, this is a life that might have been lost that will now be saved. It's an extraordinary innovation.
The nurses in particular must have been seeing things that they'd never witnessed before. Don't you like that photo?
I love this photo. And I love this photo because it shows a lot of nurses. And without the commitment of the thousands of women that go to France, you can't have an operation. Nobody gets onto an operating table unless they've been really well nursed. They need to be strong enough, they need to be hydrated.
I suppose one of the most extraordinary things for me, given the kind of series this is the fact that they were actually using 3D images in surgery.
I think this is one of the really great conceptual leaps that the surgeons make. This is the first time people have to rebuild a face. It isn't something relatively simple like a limb or a finger or a spleen that has to be removed. And so they have to think about it as a whole unit, multifunctional unit. And the best way to do that was to think in 3D terms.
Like these?
Like these. And these are live casts of Private Nesbitt, and we can see his facial wound. Large piece of artillery fragment went in. And then we have a life cast that's made so that the surgeons can discuss together how they're going to rebuild his face and point to the work that they're going to do. You can only do that on a 3D object.
So what's going on here?
What they're using this model to demonstrate is the early form of skin grafting. How you replace soft tissue that's been lost. So we've seen on Private Nesbitt that he lost a lot of soft tissue on his face, and they needed to lift undamaged tissue from areas and then attach it to the open wound. Within a matter of weeks, the blood supply will reconnect, it will become viable, and then you cut it off here and then spread the tube out, and you've hopefully created a new cheek, enabling them to look normal.
I suppose if surgery wasn't going to work, then there was always something a bit more cosmetic. World War I transformed medicine, teaching doctors lessons that would save lives in peacetime too. But ultimately, the war's technological legacy lay in the machinery of death. For all the good work in the field hospitals, we were much better at killing men than saving them. And those men were now arriving in France from all over the world. You can appreciate this global dimension to the conflict here at the Menin Gate in the Belgian city of Ypres. The Menin Gate is a really iconic memorial. On its walls are listed the names of 54,000 dead and missing soldiers. But if you look more closely at those names, you begin to get a sense of quite how global that conflict really was. This part of the memorial is dedicated to the Indian Corps, who sent 130,000 men out to fight between 1914 and 1918. These incredible images show just some of the nationalities who were serving in France and Belgium. They are great, aren't they? And they absolutely challenge some of our perceptions. The war had sucked men in from all over the world, turning the front line into one huge melting pot. To find out more about the troops from the Empire and their contribution, I spoke to Dr. Santanu Das. Looking at these photos, what's strikingly obvious is that they're all white faces. And yet it was a world war, wasn't it?
Absolutely, and I think that we really need to challenge this whiteness of war memory, because there were more than 4 million non-white people who were recruited during the 4 years into the European army and the American army.
And were all of these on the Allied side?
No, the Germans, they had a lot of African soldiers whom they called Askaris. But the majority, they were on the Allied side because, for example, in the first few months, that is from October to December 1914, 1/3 of the whole British line, it's held by Indians. If the Indians were not there at that time, the Germans would have just advanced.
This stereo photograph captures the contribution of the Indian Corps. It's of a section of Sikh bombers holding an important trench near Neuve-Chapelle, a battle in March 1915. Indians actually provided half the attacking force at this battle and helped overrun the German trenches. Why did they want to fight in a European war?
Well, we are talking about poor, often semi-literate people. And for them to go to war, that meant they would get some money, more social prestige, and of course they didn't know what they were in for.
Do you think the colonial soldiers were seen as more expendable than the other soldiers?
I would say ultimately yes, because I've come across accounts from very sympathetic British officers who says that ultimately a white life is dearer than a non-white or colored life, which is often the case even today.
The war of attrition on the Western Front demanded more and more men, and even with its empire, Britain couldn't keep up. The Allies were desperate for a new partner to join the fight, America. But the US understandably didn't want to send their troops into the slaughterhouse of Europe. However, in spring 1917, something happened to make them change their minds, which is just as well. Because the Allied forces were cooking up a plan for another big push. An attack that would cost 500,000 lives and be fought in some of the cruelest conditions yet seen in the war. This is an innocuous 3D picture, isn't it? The ship's captain casually hanging over the side of a rail. Well, don't be deceived. There's high drama here. This is a photograph of a Royal Navy ship in pursuit of a U-boat. In 1917, Germany reverted to its old plan to break the deadlock by using U-boats to sink any ship bound for Britain. Britain responded to the U-boat threat with some tactics of its own. Camouflage patterns distort a ship's shape on the horizon, making it difficult for enemy submarine commanders to track them. This is an original World War I British Flower-class anti-submarine Q-ship. And you might be thinking, blimey, I wouldn't know it given all this psychedelia. But that's kind of the point, because this is a modern reinterpretation of the original colour scheme, which was called dazzle ship camouflage. And it was designed to confuse the primitive rangefinders of the U-boats. And it worked a bit like the stripes on a zebra. All the evidence suggests that designs like this did work, but even so, the U-boats were devastatingly effective. In March 1917, for example, 25% of all the ships bound for Britain were sunk. I asked historian and journalist Sir Max Hastings how close they came to breaking Britain.
After Germany launched unrestricted U-boat war in the spring, February 1917, that there was then a time they were sinking British ships so fast that a lot of people really did think that they could starve Britain. And Britain came nearer to starvation in 1917 than it did in the Second World War. And it gave the fright of a lifetime to those in charge of Britain.
The U-boat threats and the starvation tactics were yet another strain on the home front. Yet once again, as so often seems to be the case, adversity brought out the best in us. The British people were proving to be tough, resourceful, and doggedly determined. Now, I know this poster is a piece of propaganda, but it does sum up the British condition, whereby everyone was harnessed to the war effort and we were hanging in there. So how did the British public manage to maintain this stoicism? How do we stick it out?
Eventually the war is going to be won, not really on the battlefield, but whichever side has their will to continue broken. What's happening in Britain is there's more this sort of fatalistic sense that we're in this war, we've invested a huge amount in terms of men, lives, money, resources, etc. And we have to continue on to the end.
Soon, the Royal Navy organised a convoy system that frustrated the U-boats, and food and goods were crossing the Atlantic with more safety. Of course, the real help we wanted from America was troops. The U-boat campaign, and in particular the sinking of the Lusitania, forced the Americans to the brink, but still they weren't prepared to join the war, which is understandable given the horror and carnage that was going on in Europe. But then the Germans did something so daft, so unbelievably stupid, that it gave the Americans no option and finally forced their hand. In early 1917, the German High Command in Berlin came up with a plan which they thought would distract America and stop it from joining the war. A team of code breakers at the Admiralty's Room 40 Cipher School, which was like the Bletchley Park of the First World War, received this secret message. It was in a telegram written by the German Foreign Minister, Arthur Zimmermann, to the German diplomatic mission in Mexico. And it said, it's almost impossible to believe, "We make Mexico a proposal of alliance on the following basis. Make war together, make peace together, generous financial support, and an understanding on our part that Mexico is to reconquer the lost territory in Texas, New Mexico and Arizona, the settlement in detail to be left to you." In other words, he's saying to Mexico, go ahead, we give you permission to go into the United States and nick back a load of Texas and Arizona, because if he thought that they did that, then the Americans would take their eye off the ball and wouldn't join in World War I. Of course, this plan came to nothing. But when President Woodrow Wilson heard about it, he notified senators and Congress in February 1917, as captured here in this wonderful picture. Once the press got wind of it, public opinion swung against Germany, and the resulting outrage finally pushed the US over the edge. On April the 6th, 1917, the United States formally declared war against Germany. And amazingly, a great deal of America's preparation was captured in 3D. Germany had provoked the US into unleashing an awesome amount of manpower. And now there was a colossal effort being put into getting its army ready to fight. But all this American muscle would arrive too late for the Allies' next battle, one that would turn the landscape around Ypres into a bloody quagmire. Look at this lovely little place, lovely little houses. A lot of them have got motorhomes, trim hedges, really manicured lawns and nice trees. It's the epitome, isn't it, of the 21st century bourgeois European dream. But there's another story underlying all this, because this is Passchendaele. The Third Battle of Ypres, or as we call it Passchendaele, ran from July to November 1917 and was defined not by trenches, but by mud. The British wanted to control the ridges around Ypres, and Passchendaele was the last village on the high ground to the east. But by the time they reached that ridge, heavy autumn rain had turned the battlefield into a deadly swamp, capable of sucking men into the mud and drowning them. It made fighting impossible, and yet day after day through September and October, men were marched out to fight in it.
Of course, they knew the weather was likely to change. I don't think they realised that the change in the weather would have quite the effect, because, of course, the whole of the Ypres salient is drained. Lots of all man-made drainage, which takes away the water. And of course, once the war starts, the drains break down. They get shelled, they get blocked. So instead of the water running away, it just turns into mud.
Seeing Passchendaele in 3D, you realise how this battle made soldiers feel less than human. This is how one of the men on the front line, Major Desmond Alhusen, described the battlefield. The landscape was always the same, and it made people feel ill. But the strongest memory of all is the indefinable horror, the hunted, haunted feeling that made men restless and sullen and ultimately drove them mad. Battlefield historian Matt McLachlan walked me through the ground on Passchendaele. There's no sense of loss or horror here, is there?
You're absolutely right, but I've got to say that's probably a good thing, because what happened here was just about as bad as it gets during the First World War.
Why? What did happen?
Basically, we're walking up the high ground towards the village of Passchendaele. These were the slopes that British soldiers, Australians, New Zealanders, Canadians, this is where they had to slog their way up towards this village. It had been raining for a week. The whole battlefield was a quagmire. As you can see, it's a valley behind us. And in this valley, men drowned in the mud. They were blown to pieces by enemy artillery. Machine guns cut them down.
What kind of number of men died?
In this battle, in these fields around us, 500,000 men on both sides were killed or wounded.
Staggering, 500,000. Like the Battle of the Somme, Passchendaele has remained a source of controversy. Many of the arguments over the point of the battle are about the British commander, Field Marshal Douglas Haig. Haig was one of the main men who kept that battle going. I've asked this question before, but when you hear facts like 500,000 men slaughtered in the mud, well, the obvious response is to wonder, why did he keep going? Why keep attacking week after week after week? Surely his actions are inexcusable. So wasn't he the incompetent that so many people think he was?
Well, it's hard to say. I mean, this was a war at the end of the day, and in wars, people die. In this war, the first industrial war, a lot of people were going to die. It's what a war is all about. It's what attrition is all about. But the point I always come back to with Haig that I think sums it up pretty neatly is that when he died, more than 300,000 men, his former soldiers, took an unpaid day off work to line the streets as his coffin went past. They wouldn't have done that if they thought of him as this butcher that we talk about.
No, but people are loyal to officers, and at the end of the war you look back with different kinds of emotion, don't you? Surely the decision, you say attrition, but 500,000 people, was it necessary? Was it worth it?
I think not. The Battle of Passchendaele was the last step in a long process which had been fairly successful up until that point. Once the weather changed, this was never going to be a successful attack. So I think from that point, the decision to carry on was a mistake. But then again, it's very easy to say that in hindsight.
Passchendaele was eventually taken by Canadian troops on the 10th of November 1917. This was a desperate engagement, but ultimately Passchendaele did have a huge effect on the outcome of the war. Because while the British losses were staggering, for Germany, the battle was a blow that seemed to knock the fight out of many of its soldiers. The stoic British troops were battered, but not yet cracking. On the other side of the trenches, though, the strain was beginning to show. German letters and diaries captured after the battle revealed just how beaten those men were feeling. There's as little prospect of me coming out of this alive as there is of a victorious peace for our country, and that is the general opinion of the men. This can't go on forever. There must be an end sometime. Passchendaele may not have looked like a victory or felt like one, but within 12 months of it falling to the Allies, this grotesque war would be over.